You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, our season 3 finale, and you said that we'd never get there. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This week we have been watching The Best of Both Worlds. It was written by Michael Piller, directed by Cliff Bow, and it first aired the week of June 18th, 1990. James, what happens in this one?
They're back! After forgetting about the Federation for a while, the Borg decide to improve Federation architecture by wiping it off the face of a planet. Borg Specialist Lieutenant Commander Shelby boards the Enterprise to help the crew, but ruffles Riker's feathers with her abrasive and ambitious attitude. When the Enterprise encounters the Borg cube, they appear to have a special interest in Picard, who they then kidnap before heading for Earth at high warp. While the Federation fleet gathers at Wolf 359, the Enterprise pursues, sending an away team onto the cube to retrieve Picard and slow it down. They succeed in stopping the ship, but Picard has been transformed into a Borg. With a new weapon designed to destroy the Borg, Riker has one shot to stop them before they head for Earth. He fires. Dun 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 dun.
Well, Alex, this tops all the polls of the best episodes of Star Trek Next Generation and is generally regarded as one of the best episodes of Star Trek of all time. What did you think of it?
I think there's a reason that these sort of things happen. Generally, you will see the first part of two-parters do well like that because the inherent idea of building tension gets people's excitement going. That said, clearly this is slightly more than that. That is clearly a factor, but this is clearly a very good episode as well. It builds tension, whether it be a two-parter or not, in a way that we haven't seen a lot of other episodes in the series. The threat feels more real for the crew than a lot of other ones that we've seen. We're finally getting a payoff on something that's been set up much earlier that, well, they had intended would have been paid off a lot earlier. It feels like we're sort of kicking into gear after 3 series.
It certainly feels a lot more dramatic. It does feel like this time there could be consequences, which I'm not sure you necessarily feel in any episode up to now, even with the death of crew members. But I think going right back to that teaser, it's very quick, it's very efficient. We get a distress call, we go to the planet, we see total destruction, run credits. There's not loads and loads of talking going on.
Well, even from the background music, right from the opening, you get the feeling this is something big, this is different.
And actually, in contrast to that, what is this episode actually about? Which is that question that I always like to ask. And I had thought about it, and I thought, well, actually, this is just Star Trek firing as an action-adventure show, isn't it? It's just doing that thing that we're all worried Discovery's going to do, and it's doing it very well. It doesn't seem to have that allegory, it doesn't seem to have that metaphor. But watching it now, the whole episode is about, is Riker ready for the captain's chair? That is the entire question. It is essentially a character piece about Riker, this episode, and can he handle life without that safety net? Is he just in the shadow of Picard? Does he really have what it takes? And that's great. That's very interesting.
It's a little bit unfortunate because I always forget that this is about Riker because, you know, we have the ramifications of this and it's all about Picard. So, you know, you think back at the key moments in Best of Both Worlds, it's all about Locutus. But it's unfortunate that that plot strand about Riker taking up a captaincy, it's never really followed on, and then we just have him limping away as a commander all the way up until the 10th film.
Spoilers. That's true, but if we're existing in the moment, just this first episode, I think it works here. It works in this place. It's sort of saying, well, why is this really ambitious guy who's been offered captaincies as early as the first season, I think the Arsenal of Freedom, Why is he still around? Why is he doing what he's doing?
It works tremendously well. It's just that with hindsight, it's kind of highlighted how badly they handle Riker from just about this episode onwards. They forget that there is more to his character than just being a bit of a womanizer every now and then and being a kind of Kirk stand-in.
There's a reason I think that plot works. And it ties back to what you were saying, Andrew, that you were thinking that this was going to be a sort of, or remembered it as being a sort of action-adventure, and it's not. No, what it is something that we were discussing the other day, which is the very obvious naval parallels in Star Trek. And, they've never been shy about admitting those, and Christ, by the time we reach Generations, they certainly won't be shy about admitting those. And what this whole story is a ship preparing for a battle in the way that you would have in a sort of master and commander sharp type affair. You have it right down to Picard later on touring his ship before battle, and they make the naval parallel. And the whole idea of Riker and the captaincy, and that all plays into that. But also, you're right, we do think about Picard and what happens to Picard as being the big element of this, but the Riker and Picard elements are inseparable, because the story is about that whole idea of command in a naval setting.
I think it's a very interesting way they do this, because it feels of such a grand scale, this episode, but essentially you have 2 guest stars and Chief O'Brien there. And you have the Borg.
Hello, does anyone remember me?
You've got this big map painting at the start, which I think looks absolutely lovely. You've got the Borg ship model, and you've got the Borg ship map painting. But essentially, it's pretty much a bottle show, more or less. You have Admiral Hansen coming on board ship to be slightly creepy and give some orders, and then you have Lieutenant Commander Shelby, who does the exact thing you want from a guest star, because you kind of like her because she's really smart and capable, but she is getting in there and she is shaking things up in an interesting way. She is changing the chain of command for now, and I think that's good. Star Trek Next Generation, and we've accused it of this, it is often said there's no conflict, there's no human conflict. This is all about ambition. This is all about getting people out of the way. That very line, "you're in my way," is perhaps the most explicit character moment in all of Star Trek The Next Generation to this point. I love that conflict. I like that people are acting like people and being kind of terrible to each other, but all for the greater good. It's personal ambition, and it's interesting in this context.
May I speak frankly, Commander? You're in my way. Well, we'll just see about that. No, you're actually blocking the doors to the lift. I can't get out.
He's a big fella.
They get the balance perfect with Shelby. This is the template on how to do a likeable but antagonistic character, particularly on a Star Trek show, because they tried to do that with Pulaski, and that was a massive failure. And they've done kind of the same thing here. They've brought somebody in to shake things up and be a bit antagonistic towards one of our much-loved characters, but they get the balance right this time.
And they get it right to the extent that obviously it starts off with you becoming antagonised by her. But I would say that by the end, the episode really is making you question, well, is she correct? Is Riker now at a point where he's not making logical decisions? And, obviously we as an audience with investments in the show are never going to go too far down that line, because we don't expect it to go that way, and generally the show doesn't. But it does just put that thought in your mind, which, let's be honest, a lot of the previous episodes And I don't just mean in series 1 and 2. You know, in the series we've been watching, haven't been capable of doing.
No, it's showing you another perspective on how people look at our characters, and that's what a good guest character can do. We spoke not so long ago about Tin Man, and how that was a complete failure of an antagonistic character who doesn't show you anything about the characters, despite them shoehorning bits in where supposedly he's got a background with the other characters. Here, you don't need a background, you don't need context. You just have, here's a very capable person, here's a very smart person. Do we listen to her? Because we kind of trust what she says, because she saved the ship already. She knows stuff. It's not just like she's walking in and they've said, she's really good with the Borg. They have said that, but then you actually demonstrate that in some tangible, meaningful way.
From the perspective of just watching this episode, you begin to question whether this could be the end for Picard, and they're setting up Riker as the new captain and Shelby as the new commander. Because she could be a main character.
I was going to say that very thing. I think at this stage in its life, in any TV show's life, it does a show a lot of good to bring in new characters, to bring in new blood, just to change the dynamic a little bit. And if I was watching this as it was season 3, and I thought, you know, this is perhaps a new dynamic of the show, I don't think anyone would have any problem if they brought in Shelby as a new main character, because it seems to me there's space for someone like that to maybe change the dynamic a little, maybe even change the command structure of the ship. I think that would have been an interesting way to go, and that just adds to the overall drama of it feeling a bit like they're not going to put all the toys in the box at the conclusion of this episode. That's what makes the drama, essentially, in this episode. Things could change at this point.
And if you didn't know where it was going, if you were watching it purely in the moment, without any idea, it could very easily be read as, you know, the trial of Riker to the captain's chair. Because we are seeing a Riker who is perhaps more Picard-like than he has been in other episodes. Now, a lot of that is set up here by the antagonism with the guest star and also situation. But, you know, it could easily be the setup for that story, the trial that puts you into that position. What makes a captain like Picard? It could be a similar state of affairs with Riker here. It would be easy to go in that direction should you choose to. Which is good. That's what we want. We want an episode that finishes the series that keeps us guessing. You don't want it like so many other episodes of this series. We were complaining on the last episode, Transfigurations, we were saying that there were only 2 logical directions that the plot could go in, and once you reached a certain point you went, okay, well it's going that way then. I don't think you necessarily get that here.
No, I think there's absolutely no way you know what's happening. And I think a lot of that is down to the writers as well. I think Michael Piller was out of contract at the end of this season and was basically throwing everything at the wall. Patrick Stewart was also out of contract at the end of the season, so they had to write a cliffhanger, which meant they could write him out if it demanded it. So, a lot going on. And I imagine in 1990... just imagine waiting 3 months for the conclusion to this. There's no internet. All you get is maybe fanzines and magazines and stuff to get any information. So what an exciting time and what an exciting way to watch television. A cliffhanger that matters. A cliffhanger that builds the more you talk about it. There's no home video release. There's no streaming or anything like that at this point. So all you have is, if you've taped it off of TV, to go back and watch it again, or just discussion, building up in your mind what is going to happen next in this. And I think we've lost something of that in our information age.
The recent run of Twin Peaks is the only thing I can think of where I've had anything vaguely similar just because it was so tightly locked down and you had no idea where that was going at any point. But prior to that, I struggle to think when the last time that I had no idea what was happening between... Red Dwarf, probably. The ending of Series 6.
And in some ways, it feels like that mattered less, even though we're huge Red Dwarf fans here. Visit gazpacho-soup.com for more. But I feel like this feels like it's more important, more significant, and indeed it is. I would say this is a cultural touchstone. This is possibly the moment that Star Trek The Next Generation surpassed the original series, or at least equaled it. It has meaning in pop culture beyond just being another Star Trek show. Resistance is futile. The Borg, they become part of wider popular culture from this moment forward. Star Trek The Next Generation has its own iconography. It has its own greater value. It is more than the sum of its parts at this point. It is significant. And it was exactly what it needed at this time. Running for the free series, equaling in terms of seasons the run of the original series. And so at this point, it's down to it to surpass the original series in terms of its run and basically be a better show.
It's generally considered to be the greatest cliffhanger of all time. Is there anything that really compares with it? We've mentioned Red Dwarf, the ending of Series 6. There's nothing I can think of that really... even Star Trek, which does a lot of cliffhangers not too dissimilar to this.
Maybe in terms of films, I mean, obviously something like Star Wars with The Empire Strikes Back, where you've got one character who's been frozen, another character who's lost a limb and discovered the issue of parentage. Maybe that's the closest comparison. And maybe that's the telling thing, that this is a sort of movie-like stake. Or, to go back again to what we were just saying, maybe the finale to Series 2 of Twin Peaks was a pretty good cliffhanger. An infuriating cliffhanger, but a good cliffhanger.
You mentioned movies there, and I think actually this is a beautiful thing that television can do, and it's exclusive to TV, this kind of cliffhanger moment. Although I would say films are now learning the language of television a whole lot more and having that sensibility, but I think this feels like TV. I know movie is associated with quality, but I just think this shows what you can do in terms of very subtle long-term storytelling, because as we've often spoken about, TNG is episodic and I love it for that, but here you've got these threads that have been set up both in terms of character and in terms of action, and you get them to pay off in this very big and epic episode.
Well, you say it's a very big and epic episode as well, but they, as you said before, it is almost like a bottle episode. They managed to do it near enough on the cheap.
And the other element to that that's quite interesting is the fact that we've said before that it's a story that mostly concentrates on Riker and Picard. The rest of the cast don't have a huge amount to do here. And that works so much better than it's done in other episodes where they've felt the need to just give anything to the other actors. Hey, we've got nothing for you to do. Data, Geordie, why don't you build a boat? It's... But admitting we don't have a plot for you, but your character would clearly be in these scenes, will give you the standard parts that you would have in these scenes. So Worf, for example, doesn't have a huge amount to do in the episode, but he's where he should be. I mean, this is the way to do it, and when it's worked best in this series, that's how it's been done. You have a character you're concentrating on mostly in that episode. Great, we've concentrated on them. We haven't diverted off into some weird and wonderful side plot that has no relevance to anything. Now, admittedly, that can go wrong at times, but for the most part, this is good.
I think the thing is that might be frustrating for the regular cast is you have someone like Shelby who comes in and has more to do in one episode than Wesley or Dr. Crusher has had to do for the entire season.
But it's not something that you could have done with one of your core cast. You need to have that outside element to make you question motives. If it's someone internal, it could never work. It's a story that you couldn't possibly do with your regulars. But there's plenty of stories that you can do with your regulars.
Dr. Crusher got to fire a phaser. She hasn't done that before.
That's true. She got to go on an away team. I suppose we should talk about the various elements of the episode, because as we've said, it's very stripped down. There's no B-plot. But I suppose let's get into it, because actually, although a lot happens, also not a lot happens at the same time. Essentially, you can boil it down to the Borg are back, they want Picard, they get Picard, confrontation.
I think you missed the very important element of the story, which is Geordi doing an action role. That's a key element of the episode.
He had time to crawl under that door. He didn't need to dive.
We lost 11 people. Well, did you have to shut the door right away?
And did you really think 11 people had just died there?
See, I would say that is the one failing of the episode, because they are trying to raise the stakes. And you have that effect shot of the Borg cutting into the Enterprise, a bit like it did in Q Who.
That worked better, though, because you saw the part of the ship being dragged away. You got the sense that something had, a proper bit of damage had been inflicted on the ship, whereas just a blast against the hull, we've seen that quite a lot. You don't get the sense that anyone has died.
And that internal shot as well of them shutting down engineering, you don't get the sense that there is a lot of danger. It doesn't seem like the set's being damaged, that there are bad explosions. Even the ship is shaking particularly much. So I think they could have done a lot more to actually build that dangerous element there.
You know, the other thing that I don't think helps there is that you've got Geordi coming up saying, we lost a lot of good people there. It's we can't go back down there. It's alright, I can control everything from up here. It sort of underplays what's happened there. I get why they've done it, but because you haven't had the dramatic effect of the damage, it underplays it.
Well, if you're doing that Eve of War thing, which they are, and they do it very well, you would be better having one of your regulars not killed, but very badly injured. It would be fine if Geordi had stayed down to make sure everyone got out and got horribly burned. I just don't think you feel or care that 11 people have died. So I do think it might have been good to have that Star Trek 2-esque shot of corpses in sickbay or something. Or even just a shot of Dr. Crusher dealing with injured people or something like that. Getting the idea that chaos is happening, not everything's going as usual, because I think there is a slight problem with Next Generation, and that it's just the look of it, and it's even when it's red alert, everything's flat and well lit, and it doesn't feel very dramatic. It doesn't feel like that ship's really sustained any damage.
Though, just on a side point, you mentioning Wrath of Khan there, and it's not an original point to say it, but it is worth pointing out. There are certain parallels between this and Wrath of Khan, and I think you can easily see why both are acclaimed in series oeuvre. Right down to some of the visuals when the Enterprise is hiding from the Borg. I think that's fairly reminiscent of bits of Wrath of Khan. Now, whether that's conscious, I have no idea. I've never read that much on the subject.
That nebula does certainly bring back some memories of the Wrath of Khan. But I would say even further to that, and I'm sure that's just because the reboot movies rip off absolutely everything in Star Trek. You can see parallels with Star Trek 09, that huge ship facing up against the small Starfleet vessel. That's the opening sequence, essentially, of Star Trek 09, and then we want your captain. Obviously, in that one, he goes over voluntarily, but yeah, the great Star Trek moments can very much be seen and felt in this episode.
There are families aboard the Enterprise, and they're the ship that are going to stop the Borg. There are puppies.
What was the damage? Well, no one died, but we lost a lot of good puppies.
There is that sequence where Shelby wants to split the saucer section, and you thought, oh, I never thought I'd hear about that ever again. And you think, well, oh, okay, that's interesting. Where'd you put the children? I think we should split the children equally between the two.
I think the ship should split, and when it splits, like a transformer, it turns into a June buggy.
I do seem to remember an interview with Patrick Stewart in which he was talking about how he wanted to be Locutus for longer because he wanted to go around the universe terrorizing people.
If they were doing this today, or if they were doing this on Deep Space Nine even, they probably would have had Picard as Locutus for 6 episodes or something like that. And I don't know if that would necessarily add to it. Hey, who knows, maybe Locutus is around for 6 episodes, Alex. Yeah? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about another one of the big set pieces. Them going on board the Borg ship. Visually, that's alright.
I'm glad we didn't have any kids in drawers this time. Like the British Empire, but with pipes.
I mean, they did have that same set of drawers, but they just used it to keep Captain Picard's uniform in it.
Yeah, they haven't really got the hang on this, bedroom furniture thing, have they? I mean, one shirt to a drawer. It's deeply impractical. There's someone who's never done any apartment living.
Maybe they could have had lots of different aliens' clothes in there, and that would have been interesting and distracting for no apparent reason.
Why did they keep the uniform? Why didn't they just destroy it?
Oh, that's a lovely uniform, that. Can't throw that away.
Yeah, that ship sequence, I think it works quite well. It's got the same sort of vibe as the last encounter with the Borg. The Borg are ignoring them. They're learning more about the technology. They're not approached until they do any damage. But I do think they possibly could have done a bit more damage than they did.
Yeah, you could perhaps have had more on the peril element because of the fact that the Borg do ignore them until the last minute. The peril does come relatively late. And maybe, as you were saying before, that if this was made today, maybe it'd be different. If it was made today, you'd probably have more tropes from standard horror films and the like. You'd have more sort of jump scare, I suppose. The thought that, that they'd suddenly turn a corner and be face to face with the Borg, but then realise, oh no, it's not active. You'd also play a lot more into the body horror, which obviously the films will do.
I think you can, but I think it's efficient in what it does. It gets a minimal crew over there. It puts them in mild peril. It gives them something to do, a solution to the Borg problem, albeit a temporary one, where they can say, these are nodes, if we stop this, we can fire on them. At no point does Data say, you know how we can transport over here? Why can't we transport our entire weapons array over here and blow it up from inside the ship? Don't ask that question.
Because it can sustain 78% damage. So a weapons array wouldn't cause 78% damage in that section of the Borg cube.
Yeah, but if one phaser can kind of take out a few nodes, think if you just beamed over 2 photon torpedoes, could they not do more?
Can you beam a photon torpedo?
I'm sure they've done it in the past.
But would that be seen as a violent action which would activate the Borg in the area to fight back?
Well, perhaps. And also the whole thing is it's a rescue mission, so they're not actually beaming over to destroy everything. They're going to get their captain back.
They are there to slow the Borg down, Which is what Riker is faced with. He's faced with the issue of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, really, because it's Picard versus possibly all of humanity.
Yeah, there is that, and is that classic Star Trek dilemma. I'm aware I'm talking a lot more like I'm on a podcast than usual, so I was just thinking of I'm in the nerd crew.
Very cool.
Very cool. For me personally, within that sequence, that image of Picard, just as he turns round, you have him and you think, oh, it's Captain Picard, he's alright. And then he turns round and he's a Borg, and you get that laser going straight down the camera, and you're like, oh, this is shocking and amazing at the same time. It's still a really powerful image. I just wish I could have seen it fresh at some point.
It is actually one of my earliest memories of Star Trek The Next Generation. Well, in fact, Star Trek in general. The only episode I remember seeing before this was I caught the end of another episode in which a child went onto a transporter pad and transported, and then Picard was there in his place, and I thought, oh, so was Picard a child at first and then he got transported into an adult?
A bit like Lionel in the first episode of Thundercats.
I think this was the second episode of Star Trek The Next Generation I saw, and this was the episode which made me go, you know what, I'm going to try and catch this on Sky when I can. As we know by Netflix views, the Borg are very popular.
Yes, I was fully anticipating them to do a reboot movie with the Borg, just because it's that, what have we got? What do people know about Star Trek? And they know Klingons, they know space, the final frontier, they know Kirk and Spock, and they know the Borg. So I'm surprised they've not hit that yet. I suspect they still might.
I think that's probably not far down. Depending on what happens with the course of making more films, I think that's probably on the near horizon.
The timeline's changed in the new films, so it doesn't really matter. And I mean, Enterprise did a Borg episode, and that was brilliant.
I would also say this is peak Borg. This is the strongest Borg episode that you're going to get. And it's so terrifying. You have one cube doing all this damage, and you think, well, what if two cubes came at the same time? A question which is never really answered. And all the Borg episodes are popular on Netflix. The Voyager ones seem to be getting a lot of interest, and they're basically rubbish.
There's some good ones.
There's some good, but I think you're never afraid of the Borg again like you are here and in First Contact. I think that's when they work best, and the future TNG Borg episodes feel a bit of a sort of a sidetrack. It's like, once this happens, and we'll get to this on another occasion, it's almost like, oh, the Borg are just in the universe now, like the Romulans, like the Klingons, and we can come back to them. But they're never going to be this dangerous ever again.
I think there's some very strong parallels to be drawn with the Cybermen in Doctor Who. I mean, on lots of levels. We've discussed previously the fact that there's a very, very clear link between the two. But also in the terms of their first introduction, and as serials went by, they did lose some of their horror aspects, and well, I mean, by the 1970s, they're quite campy when they make their one appearance, and the times when they are genuinely terrifying are perhaps few and far between, and it's maybe something that they've managed again recently when they've played into the body horror aspect of it again. In fact, that's kind of something that's surprising. We had a little bit of that when we saw the Borg previously, but we don't get a huge amount of that here, despite that being a clear element to their character. I suppose what happens to Picard plays into that a bit, but aside from that, we have shots of the appendages which don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to the small servos that work at the end of their arm, just moving a little block back and forth. But that's about it. I mean, what are those doing?
They teach children about shapes.
Before we get to the end, I suppose if we're talking about using characters appropriately, I think Troy is used very well in this episode. Firstly, for Riker to ask basically about his psychological state. Why is he still here? Why is he doing this? What am I supposed to do? And she gives her slightly withering responses.
I think it's actually quite interesting that he goes to Troy to ask this question, and it probably wasn't even intentional by Michael Piller, but in many ways you wonder about Riker at this point. Is Troy the thing that's keeping him on the Enterprise as much as anything else?
Well, that's certainly a question. One we won't ever get an answer to. and then we've got the scene where basically she does the Riker thing and says the captain's place is on the bridge and you're the captain now, and that's sort of an important moment. So yeah, good stuff for Troy being a counsellor, Geordi being an engineer,
and Wesley being terrible at poker, which we've seen in other senses before.
Of course, the poker game, which we've not spoken about as well, which is just that pure character moment, isn't it? Wesley doesn't know how to play certain games. Riker thinks he's the man, but now someone new has come into the game and has basically showed that he's not quite what he thought he was. And I don't know if we can draw any sort of allegory from that scene. I think it's just there to fill out the time.
Yes, but at the same time, when we were saying previously that it concentrates on a couple of characters and then the others are there supporting that plot, that type of scene does a very good job of having everyone there and giving everyone a little something to do without getting waylaid in some side topic. It still serves the overall episode while still serving the cast. It's a very good bit of balancing that doesn't take its foot off the accelerator of moving the plot forwards. It is still, overall, to the whole episode, kind of essential in getting your mind into where these characters are and where their minds are.
They even managed to give Data a comedy line. It's amazing that they've managed to insert a very silly line in the middle of possible all-out war and annihilation of humanity.
It does that Star Trek thing of setting up everything we need to know in the episode, where the characters are, what is going to come into play during the episode. Michael Piller's just a very good writer. He does it, and it all seems natural. It all seems to arise from the situation.
You know what he should do? He should write a pamphlet for all the other writers.
The whole thing that's set up in this episode is Earth is unprepared, Starfleet is unprepared, the Federation is unprepared.
The Scouts are unprepared. That's when you know it's bad.
How can they be unprepared? They've had how many? 170 years to prepare for this?
No. Look, that's not happened yet.
It happens. It's in the past. It happens.
No, because I don't know how timelines work anymore. I don't know how they work after Parallels, and I don't know how they work after Star Trek 09. Because if every time they time travel you get a new timeline, then they shouldn't be able to go back in First Contact, or every time Kirk does a slingshot or anything like that. It should all be a new timeline every time. But then Spock's like, nah, it's fine, everything that's happening was happening, and then this is happening and it's all new. Don't worry about it. You don't worry about it either, audience. Everything's fine. But anyway, yes. So they're just getting prepared for the Borg, and they don't have anything. And then the Enterprise has devised in an hour and a half a new deflector weapon, which is fine. I'm okay with that because that's good, and that's the first time they've done that. From this point forwards, the deflector will do absolutely bloody everything, and it will become a horrible Star Trek trope. But anyway, right now, all this stuff's good and it's kind of new and it's kind of exciting.
I think it works. It works this time because the only conflict Starfleet have ever had with the Borg was the Enterprise, meeting them that once, and everything they've learned about the Borg was from then, and every single plan is based around that one encounter. So they've learned twice as much as they learned the previous time, because the previous time they were just running away. So it makes sense that they can devise a weapon after a second encounter with the Borg.
Yeah, I'm kind of fine with that. And they're chasing them, they stop them, they have one chance to use the weapon. That's exciting. I think it all works. It's all perfectly paced. It's all very dramatic. So, Alex, Riker says fire. Are you excited by the cliffhanger, which we talked about quite a lot already in this episode?
Yeah. I mean, it's... I kind of have seen the films, so one of which deals relatively explicitly with this.
Do you think Picard will make it to the next episode?
You mean he's not just replaced with an android that Data builds in his ceiling for the rest of the run and indeed the films? Which, just out of politeness, no one ever references?
The format of this show dictates that we don't know what happens in the rest of the run.
You're right, you are of course correct. I assume Riker kills everyone. Or he follows that up by Worf not following his order, him turning around and shouting, "Mr. Worf, fire at will," at which point Mr. Worf shoots Riker in the face.
This is a very good cliffhanger. But in terms of drama, would you say that the next part can possibly live up to it? Do you anticipate the next part being as good and as exciting and actually living up to the potential change that's hinted at in this episode?
No. And to go back to the Doctor Who analogy we talked about earlier, one of the things that they hit on very early on in the return of that show was that when they were only having occasional multi-parter stories, they worked best when the second part vaguely related to the first, but went off and did something totally different. Because otherwise you're meeting your expectations rather than surpassing them. That's not really an option here. I mean, it's a great way to end, but it's not something that you can really get back from in a satisfying way. I think Red Dwarf had exactly the same thing. Red Dwarf killed all of its crew and then had to bring them back to life. But that's a comedy show and can write it out in 2 minutes at the start of the episode.
Not successfully, though.
No, but at least it was brief enough that you forgot about it before the title started.
I don't think I did. I think I was bothered by it for quite a long time. But anyway, that's not important right now. What is important is that we find some more things to say in Quickfire.
Quickfire.
According to Star Trek 365, following the finale, concerned members of the audience feverishly debated on computer bulletin boards. And I'm told that's not a misprint.
The writer Michael Piller intended this to be his final contribution to Star Trek The Next Generation, as he'd only agreed a 1-year contract. And, funnily enough, his turmoil about staying or leaving the show was reflected in Riker's character. Just write about what's happening at the time, it'll probably work out.
I'm afraid we won't be turning to the Nitpicker's Guide this week to find out what they have to say, as Phil Farrand is still on the naughty bench for calling women tarts.
This episode marks the first use of the now famous line, "Resistance is futile." Until, of course, it's changed to "Resistance is futile," because Jerry Ryan wants to pronounce it that way.
Now, what is the origin of that phrase? Because obviously Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy precedes that by some time, with its version being "Resistance is useless." which in itself feels like a not quite right version of the phrase. I wonder what the etymology of that phrase is.
The problem is with the internet now, it'll just come up with Borg memes.
That's where we are as a society. Borg memes.
It is exactly where we are as a society. Probably be one of Bjorn Borg playing John McEnroe saying resistance is futile. Haha. Sounds Swedish. The matte painting by Sid Dutton was slightly reworked from the one in Q-Who, which is nice, isn't it? I like a matte painting.
So, it's been explained that they ran into the Borg in Q-Who light years away. What is the justification for them now running into them here?
Well, I think what they're trying to say is they've been preparing for the Borg because they've expected them to be on their way. They are aware of the Federation now, and they're going to arrive in the Alpha Quadrant. Of course, there's a better explanation posited by the Enterprise episode Regeneration, which says that the Borg have been on their way for 170 years.
The Borg were, of course, created by Maurice Hurley, and originally the Federation outposts getting destroyed at the end of Season 1 in the neutral zone. So he created the Borg, and at the end, in the neutral zone, at the end of Season 1, as you may recall, Federation outposts were getting destroyed. Now that was meant to be the introduction of the Borg. It doesn't really work out like that, and I don't think that really fits if they're already in the Federation destroying outposts and then hanging around for another 2 years. But hey, that's when they were originally meant to be launched. Obviously they didn't get introduced till Season 2, and then they weren't properly used until now in Season 3, right at the very end. But you know, it all sort of works if you want to think about it.
It is established in Star Trek VIII First Contact that the Borg Queen was aboard the Cube. Which, as much as I love Star Trek First Contact, it's one of my all-time favourite films, that is stupid.
After the episode had aired, there were rumours that Patrick Stewart contract talks with Paramount had stalled, and Picard would be killed off, Riker would be captain, and Shelby would become first officer. That might have been fun. I suspect it wasn't true and was just a bit of publicity to try and generate more interest in the next part. But you know, it's all texture, isn't it? Well, that is us done with another series. We rattled through that one, didn't we? We will be back again soon with our Season 3 overview to see if Alex remembers anything, and then we will return with Season 4. We promise, but for now, goodbye.
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 These are the words of Maurice Hurley.
I created the Borg, you know. That's my contribution to Star Trek.